Choose Your Legend 5 refines have been confirmed to come out in a few days, and I'm kind of skeptical on how a lot of them are going to be because they're skipping a lot of units that, to be quite honest, needed a lot more, but at the same time, it's not like a lot of them are particularly amazing as is. Even so, they are confirmed to get refines, and if they're going to have the privilege of skipping the line by a very good amount, then we may as well see a good amount of effects. So I figured, just like last year, we would talk about what effects they should probably give these units in order for them to not only function at a much higher level, but also keep them around for a fairly decent amount of time. So we might as well get started. Starting with Brave Marth. Brave Marth is mainly known to be a Vantage unit. He has a Slaying Spectrum 5 weapon that also grants additional attack, no follow-up, healing per hit, and Vantage. He does also have Shining Emblem, which is a visible Spectrum 6 special. It also grants damage based on his speed, and after combat, it will grant additional allies a bunch of visible stats so he can keep his weapon condition up way more consistently. That being said, while meeting the condition of his weapon is relatively easy in my opinion, I think the big issue he faces right now is damage output. He is only getting one single hit, which could always be a special because he could run Times+4 and Spiral 4 and whatever the case may be, just to make his damage output really consistent. I think the big thing is that he's only relying on one-shots, and whether that means he either gets walled up by damage reduction or he's just not doing enough damage for it to even matter. If he isn't able to reduce the foe's HP to 0 with the single Vantage hit, then there's a good chance he's just going to fall in that combat. If you're going Special Spiral 4, then he has no damage reduction properties, and if you're going damage reduction properties, then he doesn't really have as much good damage output. It's one of those give or takes that isn't really exactly the best for him, and in my opinion, they really need to increase his damage output. And the way to do that is honestly really simple. Brave Marth doesn't really need a lot of new additional effects to really get going, but there is plenty of stuff that they can give him to make him stand out a bit more. I think for starters, there's always the obligatory extra stats that every unit just gets when they get a refine. You know, extra speed just for speed checks, extra attack for damage output, or they could just upgrade the +5 attack to Spectrum 5 that he would otherwise get from his weapon condition. They give him enemy phase desperation so that it not only pairs with no follow-up, but they also allow him to get 2 attacks out at minimum. Damage reduction piercing, I think, is going to be the bigger thing here. I know a lot of people have been saying miracle piercing, but to be quite honest, I don't really like the implications of what nullifying miracle could be like. I know we have stuff like Legendary Nana and Spring Carla, but both of them have their own predefined weaknesses that are easily exploitable enough to where it's not that big of an issue. But I think if you still are worried about the miracle effect, what you could also do is give him the Eirika special gimmick. And what I mean by this is that the charge of his special doesn't go down after triggering it. Just like how Eirika has her thing where she initiates combat, she could get her special off, and she could do it again if she's able to double, as the special doesn't reset. I think you do the same thing here. I think with all of those, even though it is a lot, it will definitely allow him to stay fairly relevant in terms of damage output for a pretty good while. And to be quite honest, I think his weapon doesn't really need the most upgrades. I think what he has already is already a good start. He just needs a bit of extra fine-tuning to really get going. Next, we have Brave Eirika, who has a Slaying Armor Cav effective weapon that grants Spectrum 5, 30% first hit damage reduction, and offensive no follow-up. She also has a PRFB that has fixed Canto 2, Null Guard, and if her special goes off, she gets extra damage based on the foe's defense and then some other thing with a special, and it's really just a good amount of damage. I think the big thing for her is also quite simple. It's her survivability, and honestly, it could also be her potential damage output. The big thing right now is that she has to meet speed checks in order to get her special off, but also in tandem, she has to eat whatever the foe retaliates back with on the first hit, and 30% DR with her stat line isn't a lot, so I think there are plenty of arguments to make for both survivability and potential damage output, especially if you are worried about a lot of damage reduction effects. There are plenty of things you could do with her to make her stand out a bit more, but that will ultimately depend on whether or not they want to prioritize her offensive capabilities or they want to prioritize her defensive capabilities, which somewhat go hand in hand together. Because of this, I figured there'd be 2 potential refines they could try and do to make her stand out a bit more. First off, it's the obligatory extra stats, extra speed, extra attack, extra defense, and res, so she could eat a hit and also output more damage more consistently. Quicken Pulse 2 on turn 1 so that she could have an automatic special. The Spiral effect so she could charge it right back up after combat. and null damage reduction or specials. I don't think nullifying specials in particular is the most necessary, especially if they want to go into her damage reduction properties as well. I think null damage reduction will definitely be a lot more helpful, and this is basically just turning her into a blue spring Carla, but I think she's going to be able to stand out a bit more because not only does she have effectiveness against armors and cavalry units, but if she does need to take a hit or a special does get neutralized by any sort of scowl effect, then she could still reliably get her special off on the second hit and take a hit if necessary. Although preferably they would want to upgrade the 30% to probably 40% just for safe measure, because 30% really isn't a lot. Although if they do want to make her survivability a bit better, again, they could give her extra stats, more damage reduction on the first hit, whether that's 40, 50, or even 40, and it works against brave attacks as well. Guard and breath per hit. I think what makes this one especially nice is that not only will she not be able to get hit by an instant special on retaliation, but she's also able to charge up her specials way faster and get even more damage output with her Moonlight Bangle. I think in this sense, it does allow her to reliably initiate combat much more often, and she could get damage output much more consistently. Although the biggest thing could always just be that she gets walled out by a good amount of damage reduction, but given that Moonlight Bangle just gives a really absurd amount of damage output, I don't really ever see that being the case. And then we have Brave Marianne, who has a relatively basic weapon for the most part. It doesn't have a lot comparatively to the other two. It really just grants speed +3, lull speed res, and also debuffs 6 speed and res during combat, and 70% first hit damage reduction if initiating combat. She does also have a PRF special that grants an extra action to the ally with the highest HP and inflicts gravity on them after. I think Marianne's is also relatively straightforward, just like Brave Marth's. I think the biggest thing for her is her damage output. She could always run magical no follow-up, which does help with her damage output in fairness, but in my opinion, I don't think that's really the clear-cut solution because it doesn't also reliably allow her to go into Wings of Mercy Gale Force compositions or allow her to take advantage of her dance much more easily. And speaking of which, I think it being a 3 cooldown special without any sort of slaying gimmick or tempo is also a bit of an issue, so charging her special on top of also trying to get your damage output more consistent is going to be a bit more tough in retrospect, which is why I do think when it comes to Marianne, it's also going to be a relatively straightforward thing for her. She needs extra stats so she can not only make speed checks, but her damage output's pretty good. She's going to be eating whatever hit she needs to because 70% damage reduction on the first hit is really good. She needs to have the ability to nullify a good amount of damage reduction, and this one is a bit more preferential, but I think having some sort of ally warp ability akin to Ascended Florina or any sort of guidance is probably going to make the gravity shtick a bit less of an issue, although in my opinion it's not really the worst thing out there. I do know a lot of people are bothered by it, so they could always do something where if she initiates combat, she can allow allies within 2 spaces to teleport within 2 spaces of her after combat. Again, I don't really think she needs a lot per se to really get her stuff going. It'll mainly just be a combination of not only being able to get her special off much more consistently, but also her damage output increasing, because with the lack of a damaging special, assuming you do keep it, which is probably going to be what they prefer anyway, you would probably want some way to nullify damage reduction or increase her damage output in a significant manner. And with low speed res already built into her weapon, she's already getting a consistent amount of damage output because of it. As long as they don't have any sort of sacrifices when it comes to choosing between what they want to prioritize, I think she's going to be pretty good. And lastly, we have Gatekeeper, who has defense +3 in this weapon. He grants allies 5 attack and speed if they're within a certain amount of space. He inflicts attack and res penalties during combat, and he has follow-up prevention. And alongside that, he has his PRFB that negates warping and has innate bulwark. And to be quite honest, Gatekeeper is probably one of the more meta units we have right now, which is insane to say because his weapon is borderline worthless and a blank slate, but because his PRFB negates any sort of warping, it is incredibly potent to have around, not only in something like Aether Raids, but also Summoner Duels, where warping pretty much is the standard in all of these modes. It is an incredibly invaluable B slot that can only be replicated by the likes of Legendary Marth, but that's also to a lesser extent because not only is it a visible buff that could get removed, but it also takes up her C slot, so that means Gatekeeper can provide even more additional support than Marth can. The problem with Gatekeeper, though, is that he doesn't really provide anything beyond that. which is an issue on its own. But in my opinion, Gatekeeper is in this weird position where they can pretty much do anything with his weapon, and he would probably still be ran because of his B slot. And that's what concerns me. I don't know what they can necessarily do with Gatekeeper that's so definitive that it makes him much better than he was already before, because again, to be quite honest, his weapon doesn't really do anything. The B slot is carrying him way too much. That being said, there are things they can do with him to either make him a bit more supportive or make him a bit more into a mixed utility role so he's not just there to negate warping. For example, if they want to double down into his supportive capabilities, they give him extra stats, which is pretty much the standard for every weapon refine. They upgrade his drive effect from attack speed 5 to spectrum 5. Drive Omni Lull, which, you know, we have something like that on Milla, but that's only for attack. I think granting allies bonus neutralization during combat would be really invaluable, especially with the amount of stats that you could potentially swing because of it. And this one is a bit more copium, but I think it could potentially work out if they do want to go down this route. They give him the future focused effect in his weapon, but it's based on his defense stats, which essentially means that if there is a foe in a cardinal direction of him and he has more defense over the foe by a certain amount, then it ends their turn automatically. That may seem like a lot, and to be quite honest, it might be, but looking at his current weapon, it doesn't do anything in the slightest. And again, I think the biggest claim to fame is definitely going to be his PRFB because it's what's keeping him extremely relevant right now. And by relevant, I mean it's only in the competitive modes. If you're going to use them anywhere else, you're not going to have a fun time with it. That being said, if they wanted to do something that wasn't just pure support, I think the next best thing would honestly just make him a bit more combative, because he'll at least be able to provide extra stuff beyond his supportive capabilities. Really, it's just going to be extra stats, true damage reduction, or damage based on his defense. So basically your Askers and Alphonses, Guard, guaranteed follow-up, and Scowl. I think the Scowl part is especially important because he's a green tank, which is a very, very poor color to be right now. Not only in something like Summoner Duels, but pretty much everywhere because of how prevalent red nukes are. I think giving him something like Scowl and Guard would be an incredible combo for his tanking prowess, especially when it comes in tandem with the amount of attack and res penalties he can inflict on the foe during combat. And comparatively to other units of that caliber, he really isn't an uphill battle because the green color does absolutely nothing but bad stuff for him. And in my opinion, if they're going to make him more combative, then they need to make sure he can actually survive stuff. Basically akin to Brave Dimitri last year, where all he really had was just regular damage reduction. I think they need to do something in a similar vein where they grant him damage reduction, but then they also give him the ability to shut off specials. And if they were able to do that, then I don't think he'd really be that bad of a combat unit. But I do think it will age a bit faster comparatively because support gimmicks are generally much more universal in usage. But that's just me. I think if they're going to refine any of these, which I mean, they are going to. These are probably going to be some of the best stuff that they can give them, and I'm hopeful and worried about what they're going to do because they skipped the line pretty far. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below. Are there specific effects you want to see on any of these units, and who are you hoping gets a really good refine? And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.